Welcome to Prepper Talk Radio. This is radio for the ready-minded, and I'm not hearing me, but I'm gonna just keep trying. I'm not. You getting it?
Yeah. There you
Well,
go.
We're here. I don't hear myself in the headset, so
I hear you. Keep talking.
I'm going to struggle for a little bit, but you're listening to Prepper Talk Radio. This is Scott and Shane, and we have a special guest today, Suzanne Sherman, who is radio host with the Cerberus Network with the Wasatch Report. Also a frequent guest here at K-Talk on Paul's show in the morning, Inside the News. What else? I mean, you're everywhere. You're kind of anywhere and everywhere that... It's like a Visa card, right? You're everywhere you want to be.
And as always, over the limit.
Well, I don't know about that, but...
well, we've had you on a number of times, and we always appreciate you, and thank you for being so willing to join us. So, guys, today we're going to be talking... really, I mean, we're just going to jump right into it. Yes, this is radio for the ready-minded, but we're going to be talking about our current form of government. And to kind of to tip it off, you want to just jump right into the Supreme Court stuff? Well, where do you want to go? Where do you want to start? Because, I mean... Okay, originally we were founded as a constitutional republic, right? That's how this country started.
Yeah, and I think the way I kind of wanted to warm up into this is why are we talking about this on a prepping show? First of all, it is Prepper Talk Radio. We're preppers. We talk about whatever we want to, right? That's the first thing. But I think secondly, as preppers, and I'm kind of getting tired of that word. I'm kind of getting tired of preppers. But as preparedness-minded people, and
preppers is easier to say.
I
botch up easier.
Yes, exactly.
It's the fastest way to get a point across.
It is. I know it's just kind of getting old to me, but
You're old.
As preppers, I think it is important to understand not only where we came from, but where we're going, and we need to understand our system of government as it is, and also as it used to be. And, as you hear me say a lot on the show, look to the past to prepare for the future. I think that also works here in this situation, talking about government. Where did we come from? Where should we be, and where are we at now? Where are we going? So I think that's the reason we wanted to have Suzanne come in, because I don't think anybody else understands it better than Suzanne.
Within our realm of people
exactly.
that we know.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
That who can speak so eloquently about it and logically and actually walk us and the listeners through the steps. Because, I mean, we're a far cry off from where we started.
And, one of the things, my personal goals and where I'm going with the whole radio thing is I like to combine preparedness and politics. And what's interesting and sometimes problematic is I seem to have two groups of followers, my prepper and survivalist friends, and then my people that like to hear me discuss politics and our system of government. My goal is to try to bring these two groups together because the preparedness types tend not to be as understanding of the constitutional implications under which we're living, and vice versa.
Agreed.
So if we can bring the two together and have those that understand the proper nature of government and where we're headed, I don't think there's going to be any correction absent some painful experiences.
Right.
Those of us that understand the proper role of government, if we could also be prepared to survive through that transition period, we can come out stronger than ever and learn from our mistakes and go back to a time when we actually operated under a system of consent of the government,
that would be a fun conversation to see. Okay, what is going to come out of the other side of this? Like, we could take an entire show and talk about what's going to happen next. I mean, that would be fun. But let's not get into that today.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about where we are right now. Right? Well, back up a little bit. Constitutional republic, if we could keep it, right? If we could keep it, and I don't think any of our generations paid attention to that leading up to where we are, at least not enough. And I think that was by design of those who are currently with what I would call the oligarchy that is the United States of America. Yeah,
and I think like you were saying, Suzanne, is that the prepper mindset doesn't necessarily... And I'm kind of referring back to myself over the years is okay, this is the way it is, and so I accept it the way it is. And although I don't completely understand it because it has become so complex that we tend to put the blinders on and prep, right? But like you're saying, if we can bring those two together, being preparedness as well as, because they are integral, they are both the same, they're one of the same, they're tied together at the hip, being preparedness as well as government. I mean, there's other ways to put that better, to state that better.
Well, we are a self-reliant type of individuals. We have And here's the thing. If we understand, even if you don't pay attention to politics at all, you don't want to watch the news, I'm going to do my prepping, I'm going to do my bushcrafting skills, whatever, you cannot escape what has been going on the past few weeks. And that is the absolute circus of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings and how disgusting and political this whole thing became. And that is symptomatic of a system of government which has failed. Aristotle had said there is a time where an entity becomes either too small or too large to be functional.
Yes.
At which point you're going to have some serious issues. And what I'm submitting to everybody is what we're seeing, where one person's appointment on the Supreme Court takes the people across this continental landmass by hostage. That's all they're talking about on the news. That's not really that's not an indication of a healthy system of government here.
Absolutely. Yeah, no one is working together in that situation, which we talk about community, and that's the complete opposite of what we're striving for as preppers, to gain community and I want to say consent, but we're all working together, whether we think differently.
And giving all groups a voice, right? That's the whole purpose of why our government was set up the way it was, is so that people would have a voice. They could speak, they could debate, and we don't do that anymore.
No, we argue, we fight.
Everything is sit and let everything get crammed down our throat.
Everything is do or die, and that's because we have lost the federal nature of this system of government. Now, federal and national, unfortunately, have become synonymous. I like to go to dictionary.com and see where people get their information. And if you look up federal and you look up national, they're used as synonyms. But if you go back to our founding principle, James Madison had proposed a system of government that was national in nature. It was called the Virginia Plan. And that was rejected outright due to time constraints. I can't go into all the details here, but just know for now that was rejected outright at Philadelphia. What came about, and he even said when the Constitution was being debated for ratification, is what we have is a government that is federal and not national in nature, meaning we have a new government that is central with limited responsibilities and adequate resources by which it can pursue those responsibilities. Everything came from the states. People are indoctrinated into believing that every right we have emanates either from or is guaranteed or protected by the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment is a huge one. Gun advocates really don't understand federalism at all, and we can get into that in a little bit in the show. We have to understand that 13 sovereign and independent states on a par with Great Britain, with France, and Spain came together to form a very limited union. The new government essentially created a system of common defense and a free trade zone. That's it.
It was basically a set of rules upon which a partnership of working together within, for example, self-defense, right? Defense of the country, which really, it was a group of states. Each state was a country in and of itself. Well, and the whole purpose was to keep them all able to work together to keep each other's rights and freedoms intact.
Well, at one point it was the United States of America the states are, and now it is the United States of America is.
I wouldn't even make states plural. It's the United States of America.
Okay. Yeah.
We look towards everything for Washington, D.C., and the fact that I even had a talk show host tell me one time, we need the Supreme Court to tell us what the law of the land is so we don't have fighting in the streets.
No, we don't.
At the time the Constitution was ratified, representation in the House of Representatives was 1 for every 35,000 people. Now in the House of Representatives, it's about 1 for every 750,000 people. Now with everybody looking towards the Supreme Court to tell us what Roe versus Wade is going to be, what's going to happen with Roe versus Wade. If you do the math on that one, we're looking at every one justice for about 35 million people. This is not a system of consent of the governed. This is not a representative form of government.
Right.
Even if you send a letter to your representative, they never even see it. Mark Kreslins, who does a radio show with me, was a senior legislative assistant. They never even see the letters. They are not moved by what we, the people, have to say. So if you want to have policy decisions decided and have a say, you have to look locally. Start with your states and work down from there. But this top-down from Washington, D.C. is getting us nowhere, and it's counterproductive. And this is why we have so much discourse. Marriage, firearms, you name it, healthcare, school busing, the pornography, birth control, all these things have been dictated from, yes, exactly. In fact, I wrote an article for the 10th Amendment Center called Parchment and Plants, What Prohibition Can Teach Us About the Drug Wars. Again, look at federal marijuana laws.
Yep.
And according to the Constitution, the general government has no authority to regulate marijuana.
Exactly. Well, then, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, you can't even collect water in Salt Lake County without having to go through a process to collect, like, rainwater.
Yeah, for permission.
And that's happening all over the United States. Mm-hmm. In Florida, you cannot live on your own land in a semi-permanent structure. Like, if it's on wheels, it will be confiscated and you will be kicked off your land. Or it can be. You know, the laws are getting out of hand. Right, and it's because we've given the government too much power, and the government does not understand what the needs of the people are at all. They care about what the needs of the governing. They care about their own needs. And
you look at it this way, you know, you're mentioning now at the local levels, and when we have local levels, for instance, zoning regulations or traffic regulations, which are intended to keep us safe. We want government in protecting our liberties, our life, liberty, and our happiness. But here's the thing. When we have these laws, like the speeding laws, we get a mission creep where they travel from being out there to keep us safe, and under the auspices of keeping us safe, we end up now with revenue generation. And that's what it really becomes. So at the local level, we have to fight that. At the top level, we have to keep this general government constrained to the principles set forth in the Constitution.
Now, as I read your last article, and you talked about, the states are really what they are a union of sovereign republics is what they are. So that essentially leaves all of this lawmaking into the states' hands and not the federal. And I guess that's the difference between state and federal versus national. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, what I alluded to earlier was the federalist nature of this government, which was intended. Article 1, Section 8 enumerated the powers of Congress, the legislative powers of this general government. You have the 10th Amendment, that which was not delegated to the general government nor prohibited to the states, were left to the states. It was determined that the states were to be the arbiters of their policy decisions and local issues. You don't want people in say, California telling people in Nebraska what to do, and vice versa. They recognized how different and unique the cultures were of the 13 states, and they were very careful to vanguard that when they ratified the Constitution. Again, for instance, a national veto, a federal veto, a negative over the states was part of the Virginia plan, which the states said absolutely no to. But now when we have a Supreme Court, a branch of the federal government, national government, giving a veto over state laws, that is what was rejected outright. Now, here's the problem when we don't understand these principles. For instance, you have people in California running to the federal judiciary seeking redress over California's draconian firearm laws, and they cite the Second Amendment. And then if the court rules in their favor against the state of California, they cheer. The same thing happened with the baker in Colorado. We had the recent case where the baker's rights were vindicated, right to freely associate, but federalism took a loss. It was claimed to be a Second Amendment victory, but it really wasn't, because the Supreme Court had no authority. What Kennedy did, wink, wink, was say, I'm going to tell you how to get it right next time. Go against this baker's rights to free association in a manner that appears neutral towards religion, and then you can have your way. And we're going to have an Obergefell of the catering industry. Yeah, you guys, this is Prepper Talk Radio. We're hitting our music here. We're ending the first segment. Stay tuned. We're going to keep going on this topic, and if you want to call in during the next segment, you can call in at 801-253-4883. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Prepper Talk Radio here at K-Talk, AM 1640. If you want to call in, the number is 801-253-4883. We're talking what is going on with our government. What is our current state of governing
at the federal or national level, if you want to call it that.
With also a little bit of maybe where it came from and where it should be.
And then we'll jump into the third block of what can we do. So we've got our guest, Suzanne Sherman, here, who we all know and love, and you guys have heard before. We started talking about kind of the move into the federal government being taken over or the United States of America being hijacked and is now run by primarily the legislative branch. Going into gun rights and everything else like that, like let's kind of go back right in where we left off.
Well, I think where we left off was the
Colorado Baker.
Yeah, we had pretty much a surreptition of usurpation of the state's sovereignty. The states, as I mentioned, were sovereign and independent when they ratified the Constitution, and that set forth in Article 7. Mm-hmm. And we have this notion now that somehow when the Constitution was ratified, we became one nation, individual. I want to dispel the myth that the Pledge of Allegiance also instills in school children. It was written by a socialist to indoctrinate school children, yes, impressionable school children, into the myth that one nation, indivisible, was created, and that wasn't the case at all. Now, the judiciary, the federal judiciary, has absolutely devastated our federal system by incorporating the Bill of Rights against the states. Many people mistakenly believe that the Bill of Rights was intended to apply to the states. We're taught in school that we have the three branches of governments that are supposed to act as checks upon each other, but the states were intended to be the ultimate arbiter of what the government could do, the newly formed government could do. Any laws that went beyond their delegated powers were considered null and void without effect.
Right. Okay, we've got a caller online who has a question and a few comments for us. Caller, what was your name?
Chris.
Hi, Chris. Go for it.
Yeah. So, Suzanne, thanks for coming on. I enjoy your comments. So, yeah, I was going to talk about preparation, but, it all ties, like Suzanne said, it all is interrelated. There will come a time, and one of my favorite statements made by Ezra Taft Benson is, a government that can give you everything that you want can also take from you everything that you have. And one of these days, in the occurrence of a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, it doesn't really matter, our system of welfare support will break down and people will not know what to do, and they will depend upon their neighbors then to provide their material needs. People like you and me and whoever else has learned to work for their sustenance throughout their lives, we'll be innovative, we'll be able to deal with the situation, but those who have grown accustomed to living off other people are going to have to make some radical adjustments. And I think that'll be, as disastrous as a natural disaster or man-made disaster would be, I think that would actually overall be a net benefit to our country. What do you think?
Well, I think, again, you're illustrating precisely why people that are prepared should not be relying on government. And again, the more people rely on government in a natural disaster, the greater the calamity, the greater your disappointment is going to be. You made a point at the beginning of your call, a government that can give you whatever it wants can also take it away. That is the main point I made in an article I wrote with my good friend Carl Jones about national reciprocity. And people that are saying, well, now that Trump's in office, it's our turn to get something going our way. They want something that's just as unconstitutional as the Affordable Care Act, which was a huge boon for the Democrats. Well, now it's our turn. I'm asking people, please be intellectually honest and consistent in what we expect from this government, because what people don't understand is if we give them this power to force down the states the obligation to recognize, despite the disparities in the standards by which they issue these permits, the government can also say, you know what, because of such incident or because of national safety, national security, there can be any calamity, we're going to temporarily or permanently either modify or revoke the permits,
Yep.
or look for nationwide restrictions on what kind of firearm you can carry, or what kind of ammo you can have, or the standards. For instance, Utah is a shall issue state. If you're a law-abiding citizen, they have no choice. They must issue one. California, you can go through all the training, and guess what? It is a may issue state, and good luck getting one. Sheriff Lori Smith, who was the sheriff in Santa Clara County, had a policy where she just would not issue them at all.
You had another question you wanted to ask Suzanne as well?
Yeah, you're not coming in very clear. I can hardly hear you, but I would like to make one more comment, and then I'll let you guys on your own.
All right, please do.
So there may come a time where I think the government will intentionally allow the economy to collapse. That way, that puts us in a position of desperation to where they will require that we sign away our rights and our liberties in order to receive the necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter. And I'm in a position where I would not have to sign such a document, and I'm grateful for that.
That's why I moved to the mountains.
Yeah, great comment. Great.
Yep.
I totally believe that's their intention is to have us submit to them. It's not they're going to be compelling us. It's going to be our own free will in because we need resources or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
That we will be willing. We'll just give up our free will and choice for things they give us away.
For a hope that we were going to receive something, right? We're making a trade. Chris, thank you for your call. We're going to continue on this topic. But I think really what it breaks down to is we've already given up so much for the sake of safety and security as a nation, right? Generationally, we've given up so much. And also we've given the government the responsibility to think for us because we're not willing to study for ourselves and find out what the real issues are and then do the right thing for our communities, for our states.
Now, Suzanne, tell me if I'm wrong. Weren't our founders, their ages, they were in their 20s and even early 30s, correct?
Yes.
So, how old am I? How old are you? How old is everyone listening? I mean, are we really this? I don't want to say. Are we really that dumb?
Are we that complacent?
Or we're that ignorant? I guess that's more the correct word.
Ignorance is probably the best word.
Yeah.
But it's also we have more information available to us now than ever before at our fingertips. And what we spend our time doing is liking, sharing, Snapchatting, Insta daily, whatever you're doing, we're wasting more time than any generation before us ever had.
Well, I think it's also about authority. It's we have given our authority away. I mean, we've given up our ability to make decisions for ourselves and given that to others to make, that they are the authority to make a better decision than we think we could ourselves, right?
I forgot who the individual was that was saying this, but this was during the ratification debates of the Second Amendment. And one of the fears that was expressed was if the militia were to stop training, because you have to look at the reason we have the Second Amendment is the founders very much feared warfare. They knew, James Madison said that standing armies, for instance, were going to be a bane to liberty because when you have standing armies, you're going to have war, you're going to have debt, you're going to have taxes, and then you're going to have rule of the many by the few, which is exactly what we have right now. So they tied that in, and what they were afraid of was if the militia, now if we have a standing army, the militia's going to go about their lives and do less training and preparedness like we should be doing and become complacent and delegate this authority. Well, now turn this up about 20 notches. We have delegated our safety and security to local police forces. We have delegated our health care to wellness centers, not taking good care of ourselves.
Right.
We now have a national government telling us what kind of health care we have to have. Our own children, and this is the crux of the issue right here, the education and the indoctrination of our children, our future generations, into this nationalist, now left-leaning progressive agenda is why they're ultimately going to win unless we educate ourselves. It is a time game. We have a trifecta, I call it a trifecta of evil that is keeping us stupid. It's our own government, our media, present company excluded, and the education system. The former two regulated and getting grants by the latter.
Yeah.
I mean, the latter two, I'm sorry, getting by the former.
Right.
So the government tells them what to do by grants, and they will continue, and licensing radio stations, too.
The restrictiveness of grants. It's funny because people are like, oh, well, we need more money. Like the current argument in Utah that there's a gas tax that they want to impose to get more money for the education system, right?
It's always for the children.
It's always for the children. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the money never goes where it's promised. It goes into indoctrination and control, right? It goes into the government's pockets to do what they want to do with it, not necessarily what they said it was for. The problem we have is we rely so heavily on those broken systems for all the informations the normal population wants to digest and consume.
What I see is that we are shamed into not relying on the authorities, on our leaders. I'm doing the air quotes. Mm-hmm. Is that and we can talk. I think this applies to pretty much any topic, from vaccinations to because if you don't vaccinate your kids, everybody's you're gonna be shamed.
Or your kid's the one that's going to get all the other kids that are vaccinated sick.
Exactly.
Well, how does that logic even work?
It doesn't work.
Well, and from the prepper standpoint as well, remember now when Obama came into power and Janet Napolitano was saying, beware sports, what did they call those centers that sell the equipment centers.
Oh.
So sports marts, that sort of thing. Watch out for people that are buying excessive amount of preparedness supplies, the freeze-dried foods. So watch out for preppers, survivalists, constitutionalists, veterans.
That started with Bill Clinton.
That
started with Bill Clinton when he said that survivalists are terrorists, homegrown terrorists. And the whole 3% movement was almost completely destroyed because he basically said, you guys are now felons. He basically made a blanket statement. The police decided to go on that. The federal departments went on that. And the 3% movement was almost completely destroyed. The Johnny Appleseed movement was destroyed. And all they were doing was trying to be self-reliant. It was communities of self-reliance. And I know a few of these guys, and they've been in prison for a long time.
This is why I also, when I talk about bringing things to the states with the 10th Amendment, I write for the 10th Amendment Center frequently. And I like to get away from the term states' rights, because then what they do is it has connotations of slavery and racism. But look now how all of a sudden secession has come back into vogue, with California talking secession because they cannot stand the idea of a Donald Trump presidency. So now the good news is we are having talks about this. And this is another myth I want to dispel, because after the war against Southern independence, it was not a civil war. There's another lie. If you peel the layers, a civil war is when two competing factions seek to rule a geopolitical entity. We had one faction that simply sought to leave. So again, secession was always legal. When the Constitution was ratified, 3 states, Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia, reserved the right to secede should this government not work out for them. Under the equal footing doctrine, that applied to all of the states equally. So what changed? Well, we had Lincoln's War, and after the defeat, which means really might makes right is all you have, and then a Supreme Court decision, Texas versus White, that says secession is no longer legal. That is absolutely not the truth. What you're saying, if you look to the Supreme Court, and this is another issue, when you look to the Supreme Court to determine crucial aspects like this, you are having, every time the Supreme Court convenes, something that is tantamount to an Article 5 constitutional convention. The problem is nobody's invited the states who have to ratify any constitutional amendment by 3/4. So we're just having a de facto constitutional amendment, oftentimes by 5 judges. We went to war against England to get away from parliamentary sovereignty. We went to war. Remember, when in the course of human events...
which we're back there now. I mean,
we are back there right now. Yep. So we have surrendered our revolutionary legacy if we allow this to continue and look to Antonin Scalia to determine what our Second Amendment rights cover, what rights are protected. This is what people need to understand. There's no such thing as a Second Amendment rights. The Bill of Rights merely reaffirmed certain policy matters were considered off limits to the general government.
To the federal government.
To the general government. What were they delegated? Again, Article 1, Section 8. John Taylor of Caroline said it was the ultimate act of sovereignty when the states created, through the Constitution, this general government, they could reassert this sovereignty at a time of their choosing by reclaiming these powers or leaving.
So what happened? I mean, why are we in the pickle that we're in right now? I mean, where did this go off the rails?
From the beginning.
From the very beginning.
From the very beginning, I would submit before the ink was even dry in the parchment.
Mm-hmm.
We had the agrarians, we had the industrialists, we had these two competing factions that were really the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians. And again, going back to the Whiskey Rebellion, this came because this was a tax that was punitive in nature against the agrarians.
Well, the Constitution itself was a compromise, was it not? I mean, between all the different states and the different...
Of course it was. That's why the government was so limited in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's no compromise.
None.
All errors are always made in favor of the general government, of big government. They always err on that side.
Intentionally now.
Yeah.
Intentionally.
Yeah,
and that's the key. Is they err on the side of giving the government more freedom, more power to make those decisions on our behalf.
And what we're taught is this is acceptable. Again, going back to the little triangle we draw in school, and then we are taught about the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
They give you these rights. And then we have the 10th Amendment called the police powers of the states, which kind of has connotations of, local police. And then we're taught in the 14th Amendment somehow magically applies to the states. That has been the springboard from which our constitutional republic has been systematically dismantled, and we'll just address that after the break.
Yeah, completely hijacked. And it's interesting because that all came because of the Civil War. The Civil War. All things leading up to that were illegal. Everything leading up to that war was illegal. And what can we do about it now? Well, that's what we're going to get into in the third segment. So stay tuned, guys. You're listening to Prepper Talk Radio with Shane Scott and, of course, Suzanne Sherman, leading the cause of helping us understand what's going on with our government. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the final segment of Prepper Talk Radio with Scott, Shane, and Suzanne, our constitutional genius amongst us.
Cowgirl Esquire.
Cowgirl, self-reliant queen of the frozen Northlands. I don't know, not that far north, but you live at a much higher altitude.
Yeah, what's your elevation
a much more pristine air quality.
We're about 6,200 feet.
And you had that much snow.
We had some snow, but it's melted now. Thank goodness. I'm not ready for that yet.
Not ready. I don't think any of us are ready for winter. Winter's coming.
I'm just ready for fall. I'm not ready for winter. I'm ready for fall. I love having 4 seasons, not just 2.
We get 3 days of fall every year.
There you go.
And we get 6 days of spring. And they are glorious. Those 9 days are my favorite 9 days of the year. Well, so before we go too far on tangent, let's get back. We were just starting to talk about the 14th Amendment. So explain to our listeners, what it is and what it actually did, so that we can kind of get a better context of where we've been.
Sure. Well, as we know, there were certain areas that were deemed to be off limits to the general government, and certain states would not want to ratify the Constitution unless there were additional assurances. So they came up with the Bill of Rights. I think the name is unfortunate because it gives a connotation that there are certain rights that are granted to the people of these United States, and that's unfortunately, because really what the Bill of Rights is a set of restrictions upon the general government and the general government only.
And not rights for the people.
They were never intended to apply to the states. The states had their own constitutions in effect at the time, many of which had Second Amendment style protections. In fact, the Second Amendment was modeled after some of these state constitutions. At the time the Bill of Rights were ratified, 3 states, in fact, had their own state churches. So there's no way to imagine. In fact, James Madison proposed a First Amendment type statute through Congress that was intended to apply to the states, and that was rejected. And again, if the Bill of Rights were intended to apply to the states, that would not have been necessary. So also John Marshall, Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who, by the way, was present at the Virginia ratification debates, even held as late as 1833 in a case called Barron versus Baltimore that the Bill of Rights could not be construed based on the intent to apply to the states. So something changed. And it wasn't just the 14th Amendment. Again, even in law school, through what I call the malfeasance of the legal education industry, we are taught that the 14th Amendment, in fact, for the bar exam, when you have to take the test and there's a multiple choice day and you choose between the 10th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, they say, don't even read it, just answer the 14th Amendment. Well, in the bar exam, that will get you a passing score. According to the Constitution as ratified, that is a failure. So what happened was, in 1925, a case called Gitlow versus New York, Supreme Court magically found that the 14th Amendment applied to the states. And this is what happened. We had a judicial coup d'etat in the 1930s. Hugo Black, who was appointed by FDR, his real primary policy or preference to went on the Supreme Court was to uphold New Deal legislation.
Right.
And based on now these applications, erroneous applications of the Bill of Rights to the states, has resulted in the Supreme Court getting into pretty much every aspect of our lives. And it wasn't intended to be that way.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, when did that change? When did it turn to, okay, let's let the Supreme Court decide, be the ultimate authority of deciding what?
Yeah, and this was from the progressive era. Okay. Exactly. And they just made it up.
Amazingly enough, that was the same time that our POTUS's father got all the government contracts to start building all the homes that gave the Trump empire, the power and the statute they had. All the federal funding they received to do all that was during the New Deal, which is baffling to me how one person was able to get that much money out of the federal government for those projects. But again, follow the money, follow the rules, and who they benefit and who they don't benefit, and you can kind of find out who was in charge and who was working things. I mean, that was all very progressive.
Well, and that also led to the split when you talk about follow the money.
Yeah.
The war against Southern independence started over tariffs. It wasn't to end slavery. It wasn't to save the Union. This was Republican crony capitalism that the South was funding for Northern projects. Now, what did the 14th Amendment, what was it intended to do? It did two things, essentially. First of all, it negated Dred Scott versus Stanford. The second effect it had was it constitutionalized the 1866 Civil Rights Act, and meaning it gave the freed blacks, the basic civil rights set forth in Article 4. So what happened is that's all it was intended to do. No more, no less. It was never intended to bring in the rights that were put forth in the Bill of Rights. It was very simple. No more, no less. But then they created this thing again, judicial fairy dust and Gitlow. Now we've incorporated, and Justice Antonin Scalia also in McDonald, where they incorporated the Second Amendment finally against the states to the detriment, actually, of gun rights. And again, this was not what was intended to happen. He chastised, actually, Stevens for not incorporating selectively what he thought. They looked at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and said, well, some of these should go in, some shouldn't, and he chastised Stevens for not bringing in the Second Amendment. And even Antonin Scalia, who's considered to be the gold standard for originalism, acquiesced. He said, I'm not comfortable with substantive due process, but I will acquiesce. Of course they did. They always acquiesce when it comes to giving themselves more power. Yeah. So now if you look at this, what he says, what did the Second Amendment mean? What he should have said, because he did give some reference to the ratification debates, he came to the conclusion that, yes, the laws in Heller were unconstitutional because they were ultimately from Washington, D.C., but then what he ended up saying was, well, the Second Amendment protects handguns because of their popularity or their ease of use. What he did then, now by implication, is leave the door open to not include other firearms. Just say it's a restriction, hands off, D.C., you're wrong, case closed. That's not what he did.
Instead, he said, okay, here are all the other things you can do. We're just going to protect handguns.
And he says, these are rights, but not the right to do whatever you want with whatever kind of gun you want. That's not that's a problem with calling them rights. Then they say rights are subject to reasonable regulation.
And then they could be taken away.
If you call them restrictions, it gives them no wiggle room. But the government loves a lot of wiggle room, and they will take it.
Yes,
so how does this
do.
apply to the reciprocity that's kind of in the? I mean, it hasn't been passed yet, has it? Or
No, the House has passed it, and people think it's great. It's not a Second Amendment violation because it's not a restriction. Here's the problem: it's a 10th Amendment issue. What they will say is, well, licenses, driver's licenses, are honored from state to state. But here's the caveat: that's voluntary. There's no federal law mandating that they do so. And then they say the same thing with marriage licenses. Again, it's not the same thing. Full faith and credit has also been cited as a source of justification. Full faith and credit was lifted right from the Articles of Confederation, meaning it only applied to judicial proceedings and records, not licenses, not permits, nothing like that at all. That's not the intention.
If it pleases the Crown.
And it's since been applied for all those things.
Yeah.
I can't go hunt without a permit.
Can't
I need tags, right?
Without a permit, yeah.
I can't even get those tags without going through a training program and getting a hunting license.
And try using your hunting license from Utah and Alaska. You'll be arrested.
Everything, my dad, he's one of the most talented hands-on woodcraftsman, handyman / he's really a general contractor. And he worked in Colorado for like 30 years. And when he moved here, the state's like, right? Oh, I'm sorry, you need to pay somebody tens of thousands of dollars to sponsor you if you want to get a license here, or you got to pay the state tens of thousands of dollars. It's like, wait, I've been operating with a license in another state with years of experience, far greater experience than someone just coming out of the gate.
But again, the answer is not to have some sort of federal legislation trying to normalize and get all of the state laws.
So that's my point. It's like, so each state has their own rules, but as soon as there's permits and rules and regulations for that in the state, then the federal government can say, well, let's correct it so it's uniform.
Go from there.
And as soon as they do that with what they're trying to do with national reciprocity, and what that does is it then takes the state's freedoms, the state's rights away, but our rights have already been stripped by the time it even gets to that debate.
Now, in our last couple of minutes here, let's talk about what can we do about all this. I mean, it's
how
definitely overwhelming. How do we make a difference? And I think first, we look to our own little sphere of influence. We start with ourselves. We start with our families, and go out from there because. We can't
have an
take
education.
A big bite out of the cake.
Yeah, go beyond what they're teaching in school. And you mentioned all the time we waste on these silly little apps and doing things. Read some books, follow. And if you like to get your education online, follow places like the 10th Amendment Center. Look at Mises.org. Look at these organizations that are really focused on liberty. There are some great books on the subject. A friend of mine, Dave Benner, wrote a book called The 14th Amendment and the Incorporation Doctrine. It's just a little booklet, costs a couple bucks. You can read it in an hour, and it will explain everything that I've mentioned with regards to the 14th Amendment, because people still cannot grasp. But wait a minute, the states can't violate those rights either. Well, that might be the case, but this is simply a matter of jurisdiction. What is the proper forum of redress? Resolve these issues within your states, because if you run to the federal judiciary, we're going to get a one-size-fits-all top-down system of government where you have a small amount of individuals creating the policy for 320 plus million people.
And that implies that we're giving them the authority to make the decisions, where we should be doing them ourselves, and like you say, on a more local level from our own communities and cities and counties and
over
states.
Matters which they legitimately have no authority.
Yep. And I guess that's how we tell them they have no authority, because we're making decisions for ourselves.
Yeah, and people will say, "Well, the Second Amendment's actually listed in the Constitution." It is, but again, it's a restriction upon the general government. Read the preamble to the Bill of Rights, not just the preamble to the Constitution.
Well, that amendment alone would nullify a national military, and yet here we stand.
Well, the founders were no friends of a standing army. Right. They recognized the threat, and they were very prophetic, I believe, if you look at what we have right now.
And again, we've given that over. We've given that away to the authorities to protect us, right? And we're not taking responsibility for ourselves. We're not being self-reliant. Whereas those of us who are gun people, I mean, I think like you referred to the 3%ers, who are willing to stand up and defend our country and defend ourselves.
Just looking at going, Second Amendment just blows my mind. But just going back to that, it's like, okay, where did all the militias go?
Mm-hmm.
What did I mention earlier? They were going to delegate. They were going to go about their lives, stop training, and delegate that again to the military. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what's happened. Do you think if we didn't have such a strong military and this strong national government that has completely thrown off its constitutional restraints, we would not be at war all over
absolutely.
the world. We would not be in this ridiculous debt. Mm-hmm. This is everything that I mentioned that James Madison said earlier has come to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way we can fix it is to start in our home. Start learning, start understanding, and then start speaking out and start working in groups to start, change the voting blocks, change how things are done.
Other solutions. Decentralization is completely in conformance with the Constitution. Mm-hmm. If you cannot let go of the Constitution, do understand we can still decentralize within the Constitution. Think about nullification.
Mm-hmm.
Secession.
Deregulation. It's not about making more laws. It's about enforcing what we have and deregulation and getting other laws off the books that are unconstitutional.
State nullification of federal law is huge, but the states have to take this power back. And the problem is so much money goes to the federal government, they are afraid that they're going to lose what they have sent there to be laundered and be returned for pennies on the dollar. And the states have to reassert themselves. And until we can shake off this notion about the misunderstanding of the supremacy clause, it's always going to be the same.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. You guys, you've been listening to Prepper Talk Radio with Scott Shane and our guest, Suzanne Sherman, today. Stay tuned for more K-Talk. We'll be back next week.